The city was in ruins. Smoke rose from broken towers and streets were filled with fire. The human army had fought hard for weeks, but their strength was fading. Every day the enemy pushed closer, and now the last defenses were about to fall. Soldiers hid behind broken walls, tired and hurt, waiting for the final attack. Many of them knew that defeat was coming. Commander Ethan stood in the middle of the ruined street with his squad. His men and women were covered in dust and blood. Their weapons were damaged, their armor cracked. They had lost friends in every fight, and their numbers were few. He looked at the sky, blackened by smoke, and felt the heavy weight of failure. Inside the ruins of a workshop near the battlefield, a man named Jack worked alone. He was not a soldier. He had been a mechanic before the war began. His hands were rough and scarred from years of fixing engines and machines. The only weapon he carried was an old steel wrench that had never left his side. Jack did not believe he was a hero, but he refused to run. He kept fixing broken tools, broken wires, anything that could still help. The workshop shook as heavy fire struck the streets outside. Dust fell from the ceiling, and Jack knew the fight was coming close. He picked up his wrench and stepped outside. Soldiers rushed past him, some wounded, some shouting orders. No one paid much attention to him. To them, he was just another face, another man who would soon be gone. The Queen of Humanity, Queen Elizabeth, had sent out a desperate message to all her people. She called for anyone left to fight, to hold the line no matter the cost. Her voice had carried across every channel, filled with fire and pride. But even with her words, many soldiers doubted there was any hope left. The enemy was too strong, too many, and too fast. Ethan's squad gathered at a broken barricade. He looked at his team and saw fear in their eyes. They had rifles with only a few charges left. They had no reinforcements, no heavy machines, nothing to match the power that was about to strike. Ethan told them to stand tall, because there was no other choice. His voice was steady, but inside he wondered if this would be his last day. Jack walked up to the squad. His clothes were torn, his face was dirty, but his eyes were sharp. Ethan frowned when he saw him. "You are not a soldier," Ethan said. Jack held up his wrench. "I can fight with this. I can fix more than machines. Let me stand with you." Some of the soldiers laughed bitterly. What could one man with a wrench do against an army? But Ethan saw something different in Jack's eyes. There was no fear, only a steady fire. Ethan nodded slowly and pointed to the barricade. "Stand with us then. Need every hand we can get." Jack climbed up beside the others. He held the wrench like it was a sword. Around him, the squad prepared for the coming storm. The ground shook as heavy steps approached. Explosions cracked in the distance. The sky burned red as the enemy moved closer. Ethan's soldiers clenched their rifles. Jack tightened his grip on the wrench. They were few, broken, and almost out of time. Yet for the first time in days, something small began to change. In the silence before the clash, Jack whispered to himself, "Defeat is not certain, not while I can still lift this wrench." The words were quiet, but Ethan heard them, turned his head and looked at Jack again. For a moment he wondered if this man, this mechanic, was about to do something none of them could imagine. The night grew darker as the battle moved closer. Streets shook with thunder as heavy guns fired in the distance. Commander Ethan stood at the barricade with his squad, waiting for the first wave to break through. His face was hard, his eyes fixed on the burning horizon. He knew his men and women had little strength left, but there was no chance to retreat. They would stand until the end. Jack stood beside them, gripping his wrench in both hands. His heart pounded in his chest, but he did not move back. He had never fought in a battle like this, yet he felt no desire to run. The soldiers gave him curious looks. Some still thought he was foolish, but others were beginning to feel something different. A young soldier named Claire leaned closer to Jack. Her voice was sharp but not cruel. "Why are you here with nothing but that tool? You will die before the sun rises." Jack turned his head to her. His face was streaked with dirt, but his eyes were calm. "If I must die, then I will die standing. But until then, I will fight. This wrench is enough for me." Claire said nothing more. She looked away, but she felt a strange fire rise in her chest. The ground trembled harder. The enemy was closing in, marching through the ruins with endless force. Shadows moved in the smoke, and the sound of steel against stone filled the night. Ethan raised his hand, signaling his squad to stay ready. The first strike came like a storm. Fire tore across the barricade. Walls cracked, and dust filled the air. Soldiers screamed as blasts shook the ground. Ethan shouted for his men to hold their ground. They fired back with rifles, their shots cutting through the haze. Jack leapt into the chaos without waiting for orders. His wrench struck down on enemy blades, breaking them apart. He swung with speed that shocked even himself, knocking weapons from hands, smashing helmets, and throwing back men twice his size. His movements were not polished like a trained soldier, but they were strong and full of fury. Ethan saw him fight and could not believe what he was watching. The man who had walked out of a workshop was moving like a storm. Every strike of the wrench carried the strength of a hammer. Every swing forced enemies to fall back. Claire fought beside Jack. She shot down men who tried to surround him. She felt her courage rise as she saw the mechanic fight without fear. Soon other soldiers followed his lead. Their shouts grew louder and they pushed forward against the tide. The battle raged for hours. The barricade was shattered, the ground broken, but still the squad held. Jack was everywhere, fixing rifles between strikes, pulling wounded soldiers back to cover, then charging again with his wrench raised high. His arms ached, his body burned, but he refused to fall. Ethan called for a counterattack. With Jack at the front, the squad surged forward. They fought through the rubble, clearing the street inch by inch. Fire burned around them, but they did not stop. For the first time in weeks, the enemy line broke. When the noise finally slowed, the street was covered in wreckage and silence. The squad stood among the ruins, bruised and bleeding, but alive. Jack leaned on his wrench, breathing hard. His body shook, yet his eyes burned bright. Ethan stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are no soldier, but tonight you fought like 10 of them. You gave us more than strength. You gave us hope." Jack only nodded. He looked at the burning horizon where more shadows still gathered. The war was not over. The storm was far from done. But for the first time, the humans on that street believed they had a chance. The night turned into a gray morning, but the sky was still filled with smoke and fire. The squad that had stood with Jack could hardly believe they were still alive. The barricade was gone, the street was torn apart, yet they had held their ground. Word began to spread through the city. Soldiers who had almost given up heard about one man with a wrench who had fought like no other. The story moved fast from mouth to mouth. In broken shelters, civilians whispered about it. In tunnels under the streets, wounded soldiers spoke of a mechanic who crushed enemies with his bare strength. Soon the tale reached every corner of the last defense line. Ethan knew the fight was not won, only delayed. He walked with Jack through the ruined street. His men were gathering their dead, patching their wounds, and readying for another wave. Ethan kept his voice steady as he spoke. "Your fight gave us a spark, but sparks fade unless they turn into fire. God, if we are to survive, this city needs more than courage. It needs a reason to rise again." Jack looked at his wrench, its steel covered in dents and blood. He held it tightly. "Then we give them that reason. If I can fight, so can they. No one is too small to stand." As they spoke, a runner arrived, a young boy with dirt on his face. He brought a message from the command post. The Queen had heard the reports of a fighter with a wrench. She wanted confirmation. Ethan read the note and nodded. "She will know soon enough. If she sees what I have seen, she will believe." The next attack came before noon. Enemy forces pushed hard, their numbers rising from the smoke. The squad braced themselves, but this time, more soldiers joined them. Men and women from nearby streets came running, shouting that they would fight beside Jack. They carried broken rifles, blades, pipes, anything they could find. Their eyes burned with new fire. The clash was brutal. Streets shook again as the battle roared. Jack was in the front, swinging his wrench with force that seemed endless. He smashed enemy blades, broke through shields, and forced his way forward like a hammer breaking stone. Claire was at his side, never leaving him, firing her rifle with sharp aim and covering his blind spots. Ethan led from behind, shouting orders, turning the wild courage into a real push. The soldiers who had once doubted now shouted Jack's name. Every strike of his wrench became a call to fight harder. The line of defenders grew, wave after wave of humans rushing to join. The enemy, who had crushed them before, now met resistance stronger than expected. Hours passed and the streets filled with broken bodies. Still, the defenders held. The sound of Jack's wrench striking again and again filled the air like a drum of war. His arms felt heavy, his body screamed with pain, but he refused to stop. He looked at the faces of those fighting beside him and knew he could not let them down. By late afternoon, the attack slowed. The enemy pulled back to regroup. For the first time, the humans did not just survive, they pushed forward. Soldiers who had once hidden now stood tall. They had seen proof that even the smallest weapon in human hands could turn fear into strength. Ethan stood at the center of the street, breathing hard. He looked at Jack and spoke loud enough for all to hear. This man is no officer, no general. He's a mechanic with nothing but a wrench. Yet he has done what armies could not. Let his fire be our fire. Let his fight be our fight. The soldiers cheered, their voices rising like thunder. Jack lowered his head, tired but unbroken. He did not seek glory, but he could not stop the hope he had lit. The city was still in ruins, the war was still raging, but now the people were no longer broken. They were ready to fight again. The city shook under the weight of the new assault. The enemy had gathered more men than ever before, sending them forward in endless waves. Fires rose high into the sky as whole blocks burned. Screams echoed through the ruins while steel clashed against steel. The defenders knew this was no ordinary attack. This was an attempt to crush them once and for all. Jack stood at the front with his wrench in hand. His clothes were torn and soaked in blood, but his eyes were steady. Beside him was Claire, rifle ready, her face hard and determined. Commander Ethan moved among the fighters, shouting orders and keeping them together as the storm of battle raged. The first wave hit like a hammer. The defenders clashed in the narrow streets, bodies slamming together, blades breaking against shields. Jack swung his wrench with both hands, smashing through armor, striking down enemies who came too close. He moved like a storm, never stopping, never stepping back. Claire covered him, firing quick bursts that cut down men who tried to strike from behind. The line began to bend under the pressure. Soldiers screamed as they were pushed back. Barricades were torn apart, and rubble fell from broken towers. Ethan saw the danger and called for reinforcements. More fighters rushed forward, but they were outnumbered on every side. Jack pushed deeper into the fight, his wrench striking again and again. Every blow was a sound of defiance. He tore through enemy ranks, knocking weapons from hands and breaking their lines. Men and women saw him and began to shout his name, their voices rising above the chaos. Hope burned again, but the enemy was relentless. Hours passed, and the battle only grew worse. Streets were covered in fire, smoke, and broken bodies. Yet the defenders still stood. The queen herself arrived at the heart of the city, dressed in battle armor, sword in hand. Her presence filled the soldiers with new strength. She raised her sword high and called out, "We will not kneel. This is our land, and we will fight until the last breath." Her words cut through the noise. The defenders roared back in answer. They fought with renewed fury, driving forward beside Jack. The queen fought like a warrior, her blade cutting a path through the enemy. She stood beside her soldiers, never retreating, never hiding. Jack fought near her side, his wrench glowing red with blood and fire. He struck with the strength of 10 men, and the enemy faltered before him. Claire shouted orders to the marksmen, keeping their fire sharp and steady. Ethan rallied his squad, pushing into the front line with all his strength. The clash reached its peak. The enemy brought out their heavy machines, engines of destruction that rolled through the streets, tearing apart stone and steel. Soldiers cried out in fear, but Jack did not stop. He ran straight at one of the machines, climbing its side as it crushed the ground beneath it. With a scream, he raised his wrench and slammed it into the gears. Sparks flew, metal screamed, and the machine froze. Jack struck again and again until the engine burst into flames and collapsed. The soldiers erupted in cheers. They surged forward with fresh courage, smashing into the enemy lines. For every machine that came, Jack found a way to break it. For every strike against the humans, the queen's sword cut down the attackers. The defenders no longer fought for survival alone. They fought to win. The battle lasted deep into the night. The city was burning, the ground covered in ash, but the humans held their ground. Jack stood tall, blood running down his arms, his wrench still in his hand. He looked at the soldiers around him, their faces lit with fire and courage, and he knew the fight was far from over. But he also knew something had changed. The enemy had thrown everything they had into the attack, yet humanity still stood. And as long as he could raise his wrench, they would never fall. The city lay in ruins, but the defenders still stood. Smoke rose high into the air, and the night sky glowed red with fire. The enemy gathered for one last strike. It was their greatest force yet, a tide of men and machines that filled the horizon. If they broke through this time, nothing would remain. Jack stood at the center of the street, his wrench in his hand, the steel marked with blood and dents. His arms ached, his body was cut and bruised, but his spirit was unbroken. Around him, soldiers tightened their grips on rifles and blades. Claire stood beside him, ready to fight, her face hardened by fire and smoke. Commander Ethan moved among the ranks, speaking to the fighters, giving them courage with his calm voice. At the front stood Queen Elizabeth herself, her sword shining even in the dark. The enemy charged with thunder in their steps. The ground shook under their weight. The defenders braced themselves. The clash exploded like a storm. Steel clashed, guns roared, and screams tore through the night. The street became a river of fire and blood. Jack charged forward with his wrench raised high. He struck down the first enemy who came at him, the blow shattering helmet and bone. He swung again, breaking through weapons and driving men back. His movements were fierce and wild, but every strike carried purpose. Soldiers around him rallied to his side, shouting his name as they fought. The queen fought with her sword, cutting down all who stood before her. Her presence was like fire on the battlefield. She inspired the soldiers to fight harder, to believe that victory was still possible. Claire fought near her, firing quick and sharp, her rifle never missing its mark. Ethan directed the flow of the battle, turning the chaos into strength, keeping the fighters together when the line threatened to break. But the enemy had numbers beyond counting. Wave after wave crashed into the defenders. Heavy machines rolled into the streets, tearing through rubble and crushing everything in their path. Fear spread among the soldiers as the engines advanced. Jack did not wait. He rushed toward the largest machine, climbing its side as bullets and fire tore the air around him. With both hands, he raised his wrench and slammed it into the gears. Sparks burst out as metal screeched. He struck again and again until the engine cracked open and flames poured out. The machine shook, then exploded, collapsing in the middle of the street. The soldiers roared in triumph. They surged forward with renewed fury. Every time another machine came, Jack found a way to break it. His wrench became more than a tool, more than a weapon. It became the hammer of defiance. Hours passed as the battle raged. The enemy began to falter. Their lines broke under the weight of human resistance. The defenders, though outnumbered, pushed forward with a fire that could not be crushed. Jack stood at the front, leading the charge, his wrench raised high. Finally, the enemy line shattered. Their men fled into the ruins, their machines burned in the streets. The dawn broke, casting light on a city that had survived against all odds. The defenders raised their weapons in victory. Cheers filled the air, louder than the guns that had thundered through the night. Jack stood in the center, his body weak and bleeding, but his spirit still burning. Soldiers gathered around him, chanting his name. Ethan stepped forward, placing his hand on Jack's shoulder. "You changed everything," he said. "You gave us more than victory. You gave us back our hope." Queen Elizabeth raised her sword high. She looked at Jack and spoke so all could hear. "This man with nothing but a wrench has shown us the power of human will. He stood when all others thought defeat was certain. Let his name be remembered as the man who turned the tide." The crowd roared with pride. Jack lifted his wrench one last time, not for glory, but for the people who had stood with him. The war was not fully over, but this day proved one truth: humanity could never be broken, not while even one hand could still lift steel against the darkness.